brutality of the act, the complete lack of regard for human life for the charge of murder in the first degree, this court has no choice but to sentence you to a term of 170 years in the Department of Correction.
On September 19, 2021, in San Diego, California, 13-year-old Eric Henderson brutally murdered his 14-year-old soccer teammate Jason Colley following their championship game by repeatedly slamming Jason's head against concrete bleachers until he was dead. The horrific attack lasted for 8 full minutes and took place at the North County Soccer Complex, where just 30 minutes earlier, both boys had been celebrating their team's victory in the Southern California Youth Championship. The killing was witnessed by several teammates who had lingered behind after the post-game celebrations, and it was captured in its entirety by the facility's security cameras. The motive, investigators would later discover, stemmed from a moment during the game when Jason scored the winning goal after Eric had missed a crucial penalty kick. If you're watching this, we would really appreciate it if you could hit the subscribe button to support our channel. We'd also love to know where you're watching from, so drop your location in the comments below. Now, back to this shocking case that rocked the typically peaceful San Diego community and raised disturbing questions about youth violence in America. The sun was setting over the San Diego skyline as parents gathered their belongings and headed to their cars, most having already left the complex following the team's victory celebration. The championship game for the under-15 division had ended 2 hours earlier with the Oceanside Sharks defeating their rivals 2-1, thanks to Jason Colley's last-minute goal. Coach Mike Donovan had already left the premises, having locked up the equipment shed, and congratulated his team on their hard-fought victory. Several players remained behind, some waiting for rides, others simply enjoying the afterglow of their championship win, their trophy prominently displayed on a table near the concession stand. Eric Henderson had been sitting alone on the bleachers, still in his uniform, cleats digging into the metal as he stared at the field where, hours earlier, he had missed what should have been an easy penalty kick. His teammates had consoled him at the time, Jason among them, patting him on the back and telling him it was okay. But it wasn't okay in Eric's mind. It was humiliation. And the subsequent winning goal scored by Jason only minutes later had twisted that humiliation into something darker. The complex had emptied considerably, with only a handful of players and parents remaining in the parking lot and main building areas. The privacy created by the exodus of spectators provided Eric with the opportunity he seemed to be waiting for, as Jason approached him one final time to offer words of encouragement before heading home. What happened next was captured in excruciating detail by the security camera mounted on the light pole facing the eastern bleachers of Field 3. Jason approached Eric with a smile, his championship medal hanging around his neck, and appeared to be speaking to him in a friendly manner. The camera had no audio, but according to witness statements, Jason was telling Eric not to worry about the missed penalty, reminding him that they had won anyway and that there would be more chances next season. Eric's face, clearly visible in the footage, remained impassive as Jason spoke, giving no indication of the violence that was about to erupt. Then, in a movement so sudden it seemed to surprise even the witnesses present, Eric lunged forward and shoved Jason with both hands, causing the older boy to stumble backward and fall against the concrete foundation of the bleachers. The security footage, which would later become central evidence in the trial, showed Eric immediately following up this initial attack by grabbing Jason by his jersey and repeatedly slamming his head against the concrete edge of the bleachers. Jason's initial struggles quickly weakened as the assault continued without pause or hesitation. The camera captured 6 other teammates in the background, initially frozen in shock, and then moving forward in apparent attempts to intervene. According to witness testimony, Eric screamed at anyone who approached, threatening to do the same to them if they tried to stop him. The fear this instilled in his teammates all between the ages of 13 and 15, was evident as they backed away, some pulling out phones to call for help. For 8 uninterrupted minutes, Eric continued his assault on Jason, showing no signs of tiring or hesitating even as his teammates' resistance ceased entirely. The medical examiner would later determine that Jason likely lost consciousness within the first 2 minutes of the attack, but Eric continued regardless. The brutality was methodical rather than frenzied, with Eric maintaining a controlled, rhythmic motion as he repeatedly slammed Jason's head against the concrete. When he finally stopped, Jason Colley lay motionless, blood pooling beneath his head on the sun-baked concrete of the soccer complex. The security footage showed Eric standing up, looking down at Jason's body with no discernible emotion before reaching into his soccer bag. What Eric retrieved from his bag was a pocket knife, which he used to cut away Jason's jersey, exposing his chest. With the same methodical calm he had exhibited throughout the attack, Eric began carving numbers into Jason's skin, the number 10, Eric's jersey number. This post-mortem mutilation took approximately 2 additional minutes, during which time several of the witnesses had run to find adults while others remained frozen at a distance, watching in horror. The first adults to arrive on the scene were 2 parents who had been chatting in the parking lot, drawn by the frantic cries of the young witnesses. Upon seeing the scene, one immediately called 911 while the other attempted to approach Eric, who was still kneeling beside Jason's body. The security footage showed Eric standing up as the adults approached, the knife still in his hand, blood visible on his soccer uniform and hands. He made no attempt to flee or to hide what he had done, instead standing his ground and staring directly at the approaching adults with a chilling calmness that multiple witnesses would later describe as completely devoid of emotion. When the first police units arrived approximately 11 minutes after the attack began, they found Eric sitting on the bleachers, still holding the knife, with Jason's body lying at the base of the concrete structure. The responding officers approached with weapons drawn, ordering Eric to drop the knife, which he did without protest or apparent concern. Officer Maria Sanchez, the first police officer to reach the scene, would later testify that what struck her most was not just the brutality of the crime scene, but the complete absence of remorse or even agitation from the perpetrator. In 15 years on the force, I've never seen a murder suspect so calm, especially not a child, she would tell the court. He looked at me with the same expression you'd have ordering a burger, just completely matter-of-fact. The officer's body camera footage captured Eric's first statement, made without prompting as he was being handcuffed. He took my moment. I was supposed to be the hero. These words, spoken with flat affect while blood still dripped from his hands, would become emblematic of the case that would soon grip the nation. As EMTs arrived and pronounced Jason Colley dead at the scene, the gravity of what had occurred began to sink in for the witnesses and first responders alike. San Diego, with its reputation for being a laid-back beach city where violent crime rates were relatively low, especially among juveniles, was about to become the center of a national conversation about youth violence, the pressures placed on young athletes, and the justice system's approach to juvenile offenders. The sun had fully set by the time crime scene technicians finished documenting the area around the bleachers of Field 3, where dried blood now stained the concrete in stark contrast to the championship banners still hanging nearby. No one present that evening could have predicted how this case would challenge legal precedents and force a community to confront uncomfortable truths about the children they were raising. Jason Colley would never see his 15th birthday, which would have been just 2 weeks after his murder, on October 3, 2021. His parents, Mark and Karen Colley, had already ordered a custom cake from his favorite bakery in downtown San Diego, planning a surprise party with his teammates to celebrate both his birthday and the championship victory. Instead of hosting a celebration, they found themselves planning a funeral and trying to comprehend how their son's life had been violently cut short by someone he had considered a teammate and friend. Jason had been their only child, born after years of fertility treatments, and was described by everyone who knew him as the kind of person who made others feel valued and included, even those younger than himself, like Eric Henderson. As a freshman at Oceanside High School, Jason had quickly established himself as a student with both academic promise and athletic talent. His teachers described him as engaged and thoughtful, the kind of student who asked insightful questions and helped others who were struggling with the material. Jason maintained a 3.8 GPA while balancing his commitments to both the school's soccer team and the more competitive club team where the murder took place. He had already caught the attention of college scouts despite his young age, with several noting his exceptional field vision and team-first approach to the game. His soccer coach, Mike Donovan, would later testify that Jason was the rare talent who made everyone around him better, not just through his skills, but through his encouragement and leadership. Beyond his academic and athletic achievements, Jason was known for his volunteer work at the local animal shelter and his participation in a mentorship program where high school students worked with elementary school children. He had an old soul, his mother Karen would tell reporters through tears in the days following his murder. He understood that success wasn't just about what you achieve, but about lifting others up along the way. This quality was evident in his interactions with Eric Henderson, whom Jason had taken under his wing when Eric joined the team earlier that year. Multiple teammates would later testify that Jason had spent extra time helping Eric practice penalty kicks, ironically the very skill that Eric failed to execute during the championship game. Jason's room, which his parents left untouched for months after his death, told the story of a typical teenager with extraordinary dreams. Soccer posters covered the walls, with particular prominence given to his hero, Christian Pulisic, the American star who had broken through to European soccer. A bulletin board displayed his academic achievements alongside team photos, including one taken just a week before his murder, showing him with his arm around Eric Henderson after a particularly successful practice session. On his desk sat a journal where Jason had written about his goals for the future, including playing Division I soccer in college and eventually becoming a sports medicine doctor to help other athletes. "I want to make a difference both on and off the field," read one entry, dated just 3 days before his death. The impact of Jason's loss extended far beyond his immediate family to touch the entire San Diego community. His school held a memorial service that was attended by over 1,000 people, many of whom had never met Jason, but had been moved by the tragedy of his death. The soccer fields at North County Soccer Complex were covered in flowers, cards, and soccer scarves in the days following the murder, a makeshift memorial that grew so large that facility staff had to create a dedicated space for the tributes. Local professional teams, including the San Diego Loyal SC, held a moment of silence at their next matches, with players wearing black armbands bearing Jason's number. The outpouring of grief reflected not just the shock of such a violent crime, but also the genuine loss felt by those who had known Jason and recognized the potential that had been extinguished. For his parents, the most difficult aspect to process was not just that their son was gone, but the nature of his death and who had taken him from them. Jason believed in Eric, his father Mark would say during his victim impact statement at the trial. He saw potential in him when others only saw trouble, and he tried to help him succeed. The bitter irony that Jason had been killed by someone he had mentored and supported added layers of pain to the family's grief. Karen Colley would later establish a foundation in her son's name dedicated to promoting sportsmanship and conflict resolution among young athletes, determined that something positive should emerge from such a senseless loss. Jason's coaches and teammates struggled with guilt in the aftermath, questioning whether they had missed signs of Eric's dangerous jealousy or if they could have intervened in some way. "Jason was the heart of our team," one teammate said during a memorial. "He made us better players and better people, and none of us saw this coming." Coach Donovan took a leave of absence following the murder, devastated that the team environment he thought he had cultivated had somehow harbored such darkness. The championship trophy that Jason had helped the team win remained unclaimed for months, as no one felt right about celebrating an achievement now permanently stained by tragedy. As the criminal case against Eric Henderson proceeded, Jason's life story became intertwined with broader discussions about youth sports culture, the pressures placed on young athletes, and the potential warning signs of violence that might have been missed. Psychological experts interviewed for news programs and documentaries pointed to Jason as the archetypal good teammate whose success became the catalyst for a disturbed individual's violent rage. In Eric's distorted worldview, Jason's success diminished his own, explained Dr. Melissa Chen, a forensic psychologist who consulted on the case. The fact that Jason was trying to help Eric only added to Eric's sense of humiliation, creating a perfect storm of rage, jealousy, and opportunity. The funeral service for Jason Colley was held at Torrey Pines State Beach, one of his favorite places to spend time when he wasn't playing soccer. Hundreds gathered as the sun set over the Pacific Ocean, many wearing the blue and white colors of the Oceanside Sharks. His teammates carried his jersey out into the shallow water, a symbolic final journey for a young man who had loved the ocean almost as much as he had loved soccer. As darkness fell, the beach was illuminated by hundreds of small candles, each representing a life touched by Jason during his brief 14 years. His parents, supported by family members on either side, stood at the water's edge long after most mourners had departed, watching the waves wash away footprints in the sand. A poignant metaphor for the impermanence that had so brutally entered their lives. In the days and weeks that followed, as the media turned its attention to the shocking details of the murder and the unprecedented legal proceedings against such a young defendant, those who had known Jason worked to ensure that his life would not be defined solely by the manner of his death. Teammates shared stories of his kindness and humor. Teachers spoke of his intellectual curiosity, and neighborhood friends recalled his willingness to include everyone in activities regardless of their skill level. "Jason made you feel like you mattered," said Emma Larson, a childhood friend who had known him since kindergarten. "That's what I want people to remember about him, not just that he was killed by someone who couldn't handle his success, but that he lived his life trying to help others succeed, too." As the criminal justice system began the process of determining what consequences Eric Henderson would face for his actions, the community of San Diego continued the parallel process of honoring Jason's memory and coming to terms with his absence. A scholarship was established in his name, awarded annually to a student who exemplified Jason's combination of athletic ability, academic achievement, and commitment to helping others. The soccer field at Oceanside High School was renamed Colley Field, with a bronze plaque detailing not just his athletic achievements, but the qualities of character that had made him special. In this way, even as the court proceedings focused on the horrific nature of his death, those who had loved Jason Colley ensured that his life, brief but impactful, would continue to inspire others long after he was gone. The 911 call came in at 6:42 p.m. on September 19, 2021, with the panicked voice of Michelle Baxter, a parent who had been in the parking lot of the North County Soccer Complex when she heard screams coming from the field area. "There's a boy. He's hurt badly. I think he's dead," she told the dispatcher, her voice breaking as she described the scene she had just witnessed. "Another boy is just sitting there with a knife. There's blood everywhere." The dispatcher kept Mrs. Baxter on the line while immediately sending multiple units and emergency medical services to the location, classifying the call as a potential homicide in progress. The first police units arrived within 4 minutes, followed closely by paramedics who quickly confirmed what the security footage had already recorded in stark detail. 14-year-old Jason Colley was deceased, the victim of blunt force trauma to the head so severe that immediate intervention would likely have been futile. San Diego Police Detective Ryan Bennett was 15 minutes away when he received the call to respond to a homicide at the soccer complex, a location he knew well from attending his own son's games there over the years. As the lead detective for the department's homicide unit, Bennett had investigated dozens of murders throughout his 18-year career, but the dispatcher's preliminary details that both the victim and suspect were juveniles immediately set this case apart. He arrived to find a scene already secured by patrol officers, with Eric Henderson in custody in the back of a police cruiser and Jason Colley's body still in position at the base of the bleachers, now covered with a sheet as crime scene technicians worked methodically around it. The contrast between the ordinary setting, a youth soccer field on a warm Sunday evening, and the extraordinary violence that had occurred there struck Bennett immediately as he approached the yellow crime scene tape that now cordoned off Field 3. The foundational evidence in the case emerged within the first hour of investigation when Officer James Rodriguez informed Detective Bennett about the security cameras mounted on light poles around the complex. "We've got the whole thing on video," Rodriguez said, pointing to the camera with a direct line of sight to the bleachers where the attack occurred. Facilities manager says it records continuously, and they haven't had any technical issues recently. This discovery would prove crucial, as Bennett immediately dispatched an officer to secure the footage before it could potentially be overwritten or otherwise compromised. The existence of video evidence that captured the entire incident from beginning to end was rare in homicide investigations and would ultimately become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against Eric Henderson. While waiting for the security footage to be retrieved, Bennett conducted preliminary interviews with the 6 teammates who had witnessed the attack, a challenging task given their ages, ranging from 13 to 15, and the trauma they had just experienced. All 6 provided remarkably consistent accounts of what they had seen. Eric Henderson, seemingly unprovoked beyond some encouraging words from Jason about the missed penalty kick, had suddenly attacked with a level of violence none of them could comprehend. "He just kept going and going," sobbed one 13-year-old witness, who described trying to approach but backing away when Eric threatened him. Jason wasn't even moving anymore, but Eric didn't stop. Another teammate described the moment Eric retrieved the knife from his bag, saying, "I thought maybe he was going to hurt himself, but then he started cutting Jason's jersey off and carving something into him." These initial witness statements, recorded in Bennett's notebook and later in formal interviews at the police station, matched precisely what the security footage would reveal. When the facilities manager arrived with access to the security system, Bennett and 2 other detectives viewed the footage in real time, watching the brutal attack unfold from beginning to end without any breaks in the recording. The video quality was exceptional for a security system, capturing not just the actions but the facial expressions of everyone involved with clarity that would leave no room for ambiguity at trial. "I've been doing this a long time," Bennett would later tell the prosecutor assigned to the case, "and I've never seen such clear evidence of premeditation in someone so young." The detective was referring to the methodical nature of Eric's actions, the controlled way he executed the attack, the deliberate retrieval of the knife, and the calculated carving of his jersey number into his victim's flesh, all captured in high definition from an angle that left nothing to the imagination. The crime scene itself yielded additional evidence beyond the security footage, though nothing as compelling as the video. Forensic technicians documented blood spatter patterns consistent with the repeated impacts shown in the footage, collected DNA samples that would later confirm both victim and suspect identities, and photographed the distinctive markings carved into Jason's chest. The weapon used for the carving, a folding pocket knife with a 3-inch blade, was recovered at the scene and would later be confirmed through DNA analysis to have Eric's fingerprints on the handle and Jason's blood on the blade. Perhaps most disturbing to the investigators was the lack of defensive wounds on Jason's body, suggesting he had been rendered unconscious early in the attack and was completely helpless during the prolonged beating that followed and the post-mortem mutilation. As Jason's body was removed from the scene and transported to the medical examiner's office, Detective Bennett turned his attention to understanding the suspect, who now sat silently in the back of a police cruiser. Eric Henderson's parents had been notified and were en route to the police station, but in the meantime, Bennett observed the 13-year-old through the vehicle's window, struck by the boy's apparent calmness in the aftermath of such violence. Unlike most suspects Bennett had encountered, particularly those who had committed crimes of passion, Eric showed no signs of emotional distress. No crying, no agitation, not even the 1,000-yard stare often associated with shock. Instead, he appeared to be waiting patiently, occasionally looking around with what Bennett would later describe in his report as casual interest, as if waiting for a bus rather than facing murder charges. The preliminary investigation also included gathering background information on both Jason Colley and Eric Henderson from their coach, teammates, and parents as they arrived at the scene or police station. Coach Mike Donovan, who had been called back to the complex after the discovery of the body, appeared devastated and confused, repeatedly stating that he had seen no indication of animosity between the two boys. If anything, Jason went out of his way to mentor Eric, Donovan told Bennett during his initial interview. He was helping him with penalty kicks just yesterday after practice. This information, seemingly innocuous on its surface, provided the first hint of the motive that would later emerge: Eric's resentment over missing the penalty kick during the championship game, followed by Jason scoring the winning goal instead. By midnight, just 5 hours after the murder, the initial investigation had yielded a remarkably complete picture of the crime itself. Though questions about Eric's psychological state and the depths of his apparent jealousy remained to be explored. The medical examiner's preliminary report, delivered via phone to Detective Bennett as he continued processing the scene, confirmed what was visually apparent. Jason Colley had died from severe blunt force trauma to the head, with multiple skull fractures and catastrophic brain injuries. The carved markings on his chest, now officially confirmed as the number 10, had been inflicted post-mortem, suggesting a level of ritualistic completion to the act rather than additional torture. This detail would later factor significantly into the psychological evaluations of Eric Henderson and the prosecution's argument about the calculated nature of the crime. As the first night of the investigation drew to a close, Detective Bennett coordinated with the Juvenile Division and the District Attorney's Office, already recognizing that this case would likely involve questions about trying Eric Henderson as an adult despite his young age. The security footage had been secured and backed up to multiple storage devices to ensure its preservation for trial. Witness statements had been formally recorded, and preliminary forensic evidence had been collected from the scene. Eric Henderson had been booked into the juvenile detention facility after declining through his parents to make any statements without an attorney present, a legal right that stood in stark contrast to the rights he had so brutally denied Jason Colley just hours earlier. The following morning, as San Diego woke to news headlines about the shocking murder at a youth soccer game, Detective Bennett received the full security footage, now enhanced and time-stamped for evidentiary purposes. Watching it again in the quiet of his office, he was struck by what the footage revealed about Eric Henderson's state of mind throughout the attack. There's no escalation, no building of rage, he noted in his case file. From the first impact to the last, from the beating to the carving, his expression never changes. It's methodical, controlled, and that makes it all the more disturbing. This observation would become central to the prosecution's later arguments about premeditation and the unusual psychological profile of the young suspect who, within just 24 hours of the crime, had already earned the grim distinction of being one of the youngest defendants ever to face potential adult murder charges in California history. Within hours of Jason Colley's murder, there was no mystery about the identity of his killer. Eric Henderson had been caught in the act by multiple witnesses and crystal-clear security footage. The question facing investigators was not who had committed the crime, but why, and whether there had been warning signs that might have prevented the tragedy. As Detective Ryan Bennett expanded his investigation beyond the immediate facts of the murder, a disturbing portrait of the 13-year-old suspect began to emerge. Eric Henderson was not the impulsive, rage-filled teenager one might expect, but something potentially more dangerous, a methodical young man with a history of concealed violence and a profound inability to process perceived failure or humiliation. The day after the murder, Bennett interviewed Eric's teachers and school administrators at Wilson Middle School, where the 7th grader had maintained a solid B average while excelling in athletics, particularly soccer. Initially, staff members expressed shock, describing Eric as quiet but not unusually so, and competitive but within normal bounds. However, as Bennett pressed deeper, asking specifically about any behavioral incidents, a pattern of reluctant disclosure began. "There was an incident in the cafeteria last spring," admitted Vice Principal Sandra Martinez after several minutes of hesitation. "Eric shoved another student's face into his lunch tray hard enough to break the boy's nose." When asked why this hadn't been reported to police or resulted in serious disciplinary action, Martinez looked uncomfortable before responding. His soccer coach intervened, said Eric was under pressure from high expectations, and that benching him from the tournament would hurt the whole team. This revelation led Bennett to examine Eric's disciplinary file, which required a court order as the investigation proceeded. What he found was troubling: 3 separate incidents of violence over the previous year, each seemingly triggered by perceived slights to Eric's status or abilities, and each handled with minimal consequences due to intervention from coaches or athletic directors. In one case, Eric had twisted a teammate's arm until it broke during a dispute over who would take a free kick in a game. The official report labeled it an accidental sports injury, despite multiple witnesses describing deliberate, prolonged twisting even after the boy cried out in pain. No charges were filed, and Eric received only a 1-game suspension, which was served during a non-tournament match against a weaker team. Interviews with Eric's former teammates revealed a young athlete who was both admired for his skills and feared for his unpredictable responses to criticism or perceived disrespect. "Nobody wanted to outplay Eric in practice," one former teammate told Bennett. "He'd smile to your face, but then you'd find your cleats cut up or your water bottle filled with dirt." Another recalled an incident where Eric had seemed to deliberately kick a ball at maximum velocity into a younger player's face after the boy had successfully blocked several of Eric's shots during a drill. "The coaches just said he needed to work on his control," the teammate said, "but we all knew it was on purpose. The look on his face before he did it. It was like he was calculating exactly how to hurt the kid without getting in trouble." The picture that emerged from these interviews suggested a young man who had learned to mask his violent tendencies behind the veneer of competitive spirit, benefiting from a system that prioritized athletic achievement over accountability. Most disturbing to Bennett were the descriptions of Eric's emotional responses, or lack thereof, following these incidents. Multiple sources described him as showing no remorse, often appearing confused or annoyed when others expressed concern for his victims. "It was like he couldn't understand why anyone cared," said one teacher who had witnessed the aftermath of the cafeteria incident. "He just said, 'He shouldn't have said my penalty kick looked weak,' as if that explained everything." When Bennett interviewed Eric's parents, Jonathan and Maria Henderson, they appeared genuinely shocked by their son's actions, insisting that they had never seen violent behavior at home. "He's always been intense about soccer," his father acknowledged, "but this is unimaginable." Further questioning revealed that Eric spent much of his time either at school, at soccer practice, or alone in his room playing video games. His parents described him as self-sufficient and not needing much supervision, having interpreted his independence as maturity rather than isolation. Neither parent had been aware of the disciplinary incidents at school, expressing surprise and dismay when Bennett informed them of the pattern that had been established. A search of Eric's bedroom, conducted with his parents' consent, yielded additional insights into his mindset. His computer contained hundreds of video clips of professional soccer penalties and free kicks, suggesting an obsessive focus on the very skills he had failed to execute during the championship game. More concerning were journals in which Eric had written extensively about teammates who got lucky or stole his glory by succeeding where he had failed. Several entries specifically mentioned Jason Colley, with one dated just 2 weeks before the murder reading, "Jay thinks he's so perfect, always trying to help me like I'm some charity case. If he wasn't around, everyone would see I'm the best player on the team." This evidence of premeditation would later become central to the prosecution's case for trying Eric as an adult, despite his age. The formal interview with Eric Henderson, conducted in the presence of his court-appointed attorney, revealed a teenager who seemed detached from the gravity of his actions. When shown the security footage of the murder, Eric watched without visible emotion, occasionally nodding as if confirming the accuracy of the recording. When asked why he had attacked Jason, he replied with chilling simplicity, "He took what was mine. I was supposed to be the hero in that game, but I missed, and then he scored, and everyone acted like he saved the day." When pressed about the extended duration of the attack and the post-mortem carving of his jersey number, Eric explained, "I wanted to make sure he knew it was my number, not his, that people should remember from that game." The calculated nature of this explanation, delivered without hesitation or apparent remorse, sent a chill through even the experienced detectives present at the interview. Forensic examination of the physical evidence from the scene fully corroborated the sequence of events captured on video. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood on Eric's uniform, hands, and the recovered knife belonged to Jason Colley. The pattern of injuries documented by the medical examiner matched precisely with the repeated impacts visible in the security footage, with the final cause of death listed as blunt force trauma resulting in multiple skull fractures and catastrophic brain injury. The post-mortem carvings were determined to have been inflicted approximately 90 seconds after Jason's death, with the medical examiner noting the precision and control evident in the cuts, which formed a clearly legible number 10 across the victim's chest. The prosecutor assigned to the case, District Attorney Olivia Wilson, reviewed the evidence assembled by Detective Bennett and made the decision to pursue charges against Eric Henderson as an adult, despite his age of 13. While we recognize that the defendant is chronologically a child, Wilson stated in a press conference announcing the decision, the evidence shows a level of premeditation, brutality, and lack of remorse that cannot be adequately addressed in the juvenile system. This decision would spark intense debate within legal circles and the broader public, raising questions about the culpability of children and the role of the educational and athletic systems in identifying and addressing warning signs before they culminate in violence. As the investigation transitioned toward preparing for trial, Detective Bennett continued to explore the relationship between Eric Henderson and Jason Colley, seeking to understand how mentorship had twisted into murderous resentment. Interviews with other teammates revealed that Jason had indeed taken a special interest in helping Eric improve his penalty kicks, often staying after practice to work with him one-on-one. Jason was like that with everyone, one teammate explained, but he spent extra time with Eric because he said Eric had the potential to be better than all of us if he could just get out of his own head. This dynamic, the talented older player trying to mentor the promising but troubled younger one, added layers of tragedy to an already devastating case, suggesting that Jason's very kindness may have intensified Eric's feelings of inadequacy and resentment. Coach Mike Donovan, still struggling to come to terms with what had happened, provided additional context during his formal interview. "I knew Eric was intensely competitive, but so are most kids at that level," he told Bennett. "What I didn't see was how deeply he internalized any perceived failure." When asked if he had been aware of Eric's previous violent incidents at school, Donovan admitted that he had heard rumors, but had been assured by the athletic director that they were overblown and that Eric was working through some adjustment issues. This revelation added another dimension to the investigation, suggesting institutional failure across multiple systems that should have recognized and addressed Eric's dangerous behavior long before it escalated to murder. As news of the case spread throughout San Diego and then nationally, Bennett found himself fielding calls from parents and coaches from other teams who had interacted with Eric Henderson at tournaments and matches. A consistent picture emerged of a talented but feared young player who was given extraordinary leeway due to his abilities on the field. "There was an incident at a tournament in Riverside last year," one opposing coach reported, where Eric deliberately cleated an opposing player who had been outperforming him. "It was so obviously intentional that our entire bench was screaming for a red card, but the referee only gave him a yellow, and his coach kept him in the game." This pattern of enabling behavior from adults in positions of authority became an important secondary focus of the investigation, highlighting how systems designed to develop young athletes had failed to protect them by prioritizing talent over character and achievement over accountability. By the time Eric Henderson was formally arraigned on charges of first-degree murder, with special circumstances of lying in wait and extreme brutality, Detective Ryan Bennett had compiled one of the most comprehensive case files of his career. The evidence against the 13-year-old suspect was overwhelming, from the unambiguous security footage to the forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Eric's own statements demonstrating clear motive and absence of remorse. What made the case unique and particularly disturbing was not the question of guilt, which seemed beyond reasonable doubt from the first moments of the investigation, but the questions it raised about how a child so young could commit such a calculated act of violence, and how the systems surrounding him had failed to recognize and address the warning signs before it was too late. District Attorney Olivia Wilson had prosecuted hundreds of murder cases throughout her 15-year career with the San Diego County Prosecutor's Office, but none had generated the level of public interest or professional soul-searching as the state of California versus Eric Henderson. As she organized the mountain of evidence collected by Detective Bennett's team, Wilson focused on building a narrative that would not only prove Eric's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, a relatively straightforward task given the overwhelming evidence, but also justify trying a 13-year-old as an adult and pursuing the maximum possible penalty. The security footage showing the brutal 8-minute attack formed the backbone of her case, but Wilson knew that to secure the outcome she sought, she needed to establish a pattern of behavior that demonstrated both premeditation and a disturbing lack of capacity for empathy or remorse. The prosecution's case began with obtaining a court order for complete access to Eric's school records, including incidents that had been handled informally and kept out of his official file. What emerged was damning, a pattern of escalating violence that had been systematically downplayed or concealed by school officials eager to protect their star athlete. The incident reports read like a roadmap to murder, Wilson told her team during a strategy session. Each violent outburst followed the same trigger, Eric being outperformed or criticized, and each time, the adults around him found ways to minimize the behavior instead of addressing it. The most disturbing example came from an incident 6 months before the murder, when Eric had pushed a teammate down a flight of stairs after the boy was selected as starter over him for an important game. The official report classified it as an accidental collision, despite multiple witnesses describing Eric waiting at the top of the stairs and deliberately shoving the boy when no adults were looking. Wilson's team conducted extensive interviews with psychological experts specializing in adolescent behavior, seeking to understand the roots of Eric's apparent sociopathy, while building the case that he represented a danger that could not be adequately addressed in the juvenile system. Dr. Rebecca Chen, a forensic psychologist who reviewed the evidence, provided a particularly valuable assessment. What we're seeing in Eric Henderson is not typical teenage impulsivity or poor anger management, but a calculated pattern of violence in response to perceived status threats. Most concerning is his complete lack of empathetic response to the suffering of others, which is evident in both his previous incidents and in his methodical execution of the murder itself. This expert opinion would become central to the prosecution's argument that Eric, despite his chronological age, demonstrated a level of criminal sophistication more typical of adult offenders. The motive for the murder, initially appearing straightforward as jealousy over Jason, scoring the winning goal after Eric missed his penalty kick, revealed greater complexity as Wilson's team analyzed Eric's journal entries and electronic communications. In the weeks leading up to the championship game, Eric had written repeatedly about his belief that the team's success should be his story, expressing frustration that Jason received more attention and praise despite Eric considering himself the superior player. "It's my team," read one entry, dated just a week before the murder. "Everyone knows I'm the reason we win, but they keep talking about Jason like he's some kind of soccer god. It's all about who scores the last goal, and I'm going to make sure that's me." This premeditation, combined with the post-murder carving of his jersey number into Jason's skin, painted a picture not of a momentary loss of control, but of a calculated effort to reclaim what Eric perceived as his rightful recognition. The prosecution's case was further strengthened by interviews with Eric's former friends and acquaintances, who described a pattern of manipulative behavior that had largely escaped adult detection. "Eric was really good at being whoever adults wanted him to be," explained one former friend who had distanced himself from Eric after witnessing several disturbing incidents. "With coaches and teachers, he was this focused, respectful kid who just wanted to improve. But when they weren't around, he'd brag about how easy it was to fool them, how he could do whatever he wanted because they needed him to win games." Another teammate described how Eric would systematically undermine anyone he perceived as a rival, spreading rumors, sabotaging their equipment, or intimidating them during practice in ways that could be disguised as normal competitive behavior. Perhaps the most damning evidence came from Eric's online activities, which Detective Bennett's team had meticulously documented after obtaining warrants for his electronic devices and accounts. In private messages with online gaming friends, none of whom knew him in real life, Eric had discussed his resentment of Jason in disturbing detail, including one message sent just days before the murder that read, "There's this kid on my team who thinks he's better than me. Everyone loves him because he acts all perfect and helpful. I've been thinking about shutting him up for good." When one online friend had responded with, "LOL, don't do anything crazy," Eric had replied, "Why not? Nobody would see it coming, and then everyone would finally take me seriously." These communications, revealing both premeditation and a disturbing disconnect between actions and consequences, would become powerful evidence in the prosecution's case for trying Eric as an adult. The forensic evidence collected from the crime scene provided further insight into the calculated nature of the attack. The medical examiner's detailed report noted that while the first few impacts to Jason's head had been delivered with variable force, the majority showed a consistent pattern of controlled, rhythmic strikes that continued well past the point when the victim would have lost consciousness. This is not consistent with a frenzied attack driven by uncontrolled rage, the report stated, but rather with a methodical execution carried out with purpose and control. Similarly, the analysis of the post-mortem carving showed steady, deliberate cuts that had been made with precision despite the blood-slickened surface of the victim's skin, suggesting a level of focus and detachment that experts described as profoundly abnormal in an offender of any age. As the case progressed toward trial, Wilson faced intense scrutiny from both legal experts and child advocacy groups, many of whom argued that trying a 13-year-old as an adult represented a failure of the justice system to recognize the developmental realities of adolescence. In response, Wilson's team compiled research on the rare subset of juvenile offenders who demonstrate adult-like criminal sophistication at very young ages, particularly those exhibiting callous unemotional traits associated with developing psychopathy. While we acknowledge that most 13-year-olds lack the emotional and cognitive development to be held fully accountable as adults, Wilson stated in a press conference addressing these concerns, the evidence in this case points to an individual who calculated his actions, understood their consequences, and showed no remorse or emotional response consistent with his age, either before, during, or after taking another child's life in a prolonged and brutal manner. The legal strategy developed by Wilson and her team centered on three key arguments. First, that the murder was premeditated, as evidenced by Eric's writings and online communications. Second, that the method of execution demonstrated extreme cruelty and criminal sophistication beyond what could be attributed to typical adolescent impulsivity. And third, that Eric's history of concealed violence, combined with his complete lack of remorse, indicated a danger to society that could not be adequately addressed within the juvenile system, which would be required to release him at age 25, regardless of rehabilitation. To support these arguments, Wilson secured testimony from experts in adolescent psychology, forensic pathology, and juvenile criminal behavior, each tasked with explaining to the jury the unusual nature of the case within their field of expertise. As the trial date approached, one final and devastating piece of evidence emerged when Eric's court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Alan Morris, reported that during their evaluation sessions, Eric had expressed frustration not about facing consequences for the murder, but about the fact that the security footage had made it look worse than it was. When Dr. Morris asked Eric to elaborate, he reportedly stated, "Everyone's acting like 8 minutes is so long, but it needed to be done right. If I had just hit him once or twice, he might have gotten back up eventually, and then the whole point would have been lost." This statement, which Dr. Morris was legally obligated to report, as it indicated ongoing dangerousness rather than remorse, would ultimately be admitted into evidence despite objections from Eric's defense team, providing a chilling glimpse into the teenager's thought processes. The final component of the prosecution's case involved the school system's failure to address Eric's previous violent behavior, which Wilson believed had directly contributed to the conditions that made the murder possible. Through subpoenaed emails and internal communications, her team uncovered a pattern of deliberate concealment by school administrators and athletic directors who had prioritized Eric's contributions to their sports program over the safety concerns raised by teachers and parents. In one particularly damning email, the athletic director had written to the principal, "I understand the concerns about Eric's behavior, but he's the best prospect we've had in years. If we handle this through official channels, we risk losing him to suspension right before regionals. Let's manage this internally." This institutional failure would become a secondary focus of the trial, with Wilson determined to hold accountable not just Eric Henderson for his actions, but the system that had enabled and concealed his dangerous behavior until it culminated in murder. By the time the case was ready for trial, District Attorney Olivia Wilson had assembled what legal observers described as one of the most comprehensive and compelling cases ever brought against a juvenile defendant. The evidence of premeditation, the graphic security footage of the prolonged attack, the history of escalating violence, the lack of remorse, and the calculated post-mortem mutilation all pointed to a defendant who, despite his young age, had committed a crime of adult-like sophistication and cruelty. As jury selection began in what would become one of the most closely watched trials in California history, Wilson prepared to make the case that would ultimately lead to an unprecedented sentence for one of the youngest defendants ever tried as an adult in the state's history, a case that would force the legal system, the educational system, and society at large to confront uncomfortable questions about youth violence, accountability, and the sometimes deadly consequences of prioritizing athletic achievement over character development. Eric Henderson was arrested at 7:04 p.m. on September 19, 2021, just 22 minutes after the 911 call reporting the attack on Jason Colley. Unlike most murder arrests, which follow investigations of varying lengths, Eric was taken into custody at the scene, still covered in his victim's blood, and holding the knife he had used to carve his jersey number into Jason's chest. Officer Maria Sanchez, the first to place handcuffs on the 13-year-old, would later testify about the eerie calmness with which Eric complied with her commands. "In my 15 years on the force, I've never seen anyone, adult or child, so composed immediately after committing such a violent act," she told the court. "He held his wrists out for the cuffs like he was offering to help me do my job, all while his teammate lay dead a few feet away." The initial processing of Eric Henderson followed standard procedure for juvenile suspects, with two significant differences that reflected the extreme nature of the crime. First, due to the brutality of the murder and Eric's apparent lack of emotional distress, he was placed on suicide watch despite showing no indications of self-harm risk, a precautionary measure that the arresting officers felt necessary given the disconnect between the situation and Eric's affect. Second, rather than being processed through the standard juvenile intake system, Eric was held in a segregated area of the San Diego Central Jail while emergency motions were filed regarding whether he would be charged as an adult. During this initial holding period, officers noted that Eric asked several times about the security camera footage, wanting to know if it had captured everything and whether it had audio. Questions that investigators found disturbing in their implication that Eric was concerned not about what he had done, but about how completely it had been documented. Detective Ryan Bennett arrived at the jail at 8:30 p.m. to conduct the initial interview with Eric, knowing that the suspect's parents had been contacted but were still en route. Under California law, a 13-year-old could not be questioned without a parent or guardian present, so Bennett used the time to observe Eric through the one-way glass of the holding room. What he saw troubled him deeply. Rather than displaying the typical behaviors of juvenile suspects, crying, pacing, or withdrawing into themselves, Eric sat calmly at the table, occasionally examining his blood-stained hands with what appeared to be mild interest. When a female officer entered to ask if he wanted water, Eric smiled politely and said, "Yes, please. And could I wash my hands? This is starting to feel uncomfortable." The casual nature of the request, as if the blood covering his hands was merely an inconvenience rather than evidence of a life he had just taken, sent a chill through the observing detective. When Jonathan and Maria Henderson arrived at the jail at 9:12 p.m., they appeared shell-shocked, struggling to comprehend that their son was being held for murder. Detective Bennett briefed them privately before the interview, explaining that security footage had captured the entire incident and that multiple witnesses had identified Eric as the attacker. "There must be some mistake," Jonathan Henderson insisted. "Eric is competitive, yes, but he would never hurt anyone intentionally." Bennett, recognizing the parents' state of denial, made the decision to show them a short clip from the security footage, just enough to confirm that their son was indeed the perpetrator and that there was no question of mistaken identity. Maria Henderson collapsed into her husband's arms upon viewing the footage, while Jonathan stared at the screen in apparent disbelief before whispering, "That can't be our son. That can't be Eric." The formal interview began at 9:45 p.m. with Eric Henderson, both his parents, Detective Bennett, and a second detective present in the interview room. After reading Eric his Miranda rights, modified slightly for juvenile comprehension, Bennett asked if Eric understood what was happening and why he had been arrested. "I'm here because Jason is dead," Eric replied in a matter-of-fact tone that caused his mother to gasp audibly. "I killed him after the game." This immediate and straightforward confession, delivered without prompting or apparent emotion, set the tone for what would become one of the most disturbing interrogations in Detective Bennett's career. When asked why he had attacked Jason, Eric's response was equally direct. "He took my moment. Everyone was celebrating him for scoring that goal, but they forgot that I should have been the one who won the game. I missed the penalty, but that was just bad luck. He didn't deserve all that attention." As the interview progressed, Bennett strategically focused on establishing the timeline of events and Eric's state of mind before, during, and after the attack. When asked if the attack had been planned in advance, Eric hesitated for the first time before responding. "Not exactly planned, but I knew something had to happen." After the game, when everyone was crowding around Jason instead of focusing on how well I'd played for the rest of the match, I started thinking about how unfair it was. This answer, suggesting a period of contemplation rather than an immediate emotional outburst, would later support the prosecution's argument for premeditation, despite Eric's young age. When Bennett pressed for more details about this thought process, Eric explained with disturbing clarity, "I decided during the celebration that Jason needed to understand how it felt to have something taken away from you. I was waiting for the right moment when not many people were around." The most chilling portion of the interrogation came when Detective Bennett asked Eric about the duration of the attack, the 8 continuous minutes captured on security footage, during which he repeatedly slammed Jason's head against the concrete. "Did you realize how long you were continuing the attack?" Bennett asked, to which Eric replied with apparent confusion at the question itself. "I needed to be sure he wouldn't get back up. Each time I thought about stopping, I remembered how everyone cheered for him instead of me, and I kept going. It wasn't about time. It was about finishing what I started." This calculated response, delivered while Eric's parents sat in stunned silence beside him, revealed a level of intentionality that belied any defense based on momentary passion or adolescent impulsivity. When questioned specifically about carving his jersey number into Jason's chest after he was already dead, Eric provided the explanation that would later become central to the prosecution's case regarding his disturbed psychology. "I wanted to make sure everyone remembered whose day it should have been. Number 10 was my number, my position, my team. I wasn't trying to hurt him more. He was already dead. I was making a point." This distinction, that the mutilation was not about causing additional suffering but about making a symbolic statement, demonstrated a level of abstract thinking and calculated messaging that experts would later testify was inconsistent with typical adolescent cognitive development, particularly in the context of extreme violence. Throughout the 2-hour interrogation, Eric's parents remained largely silent, occasionally attempting to reach for their son's hand, only to have him pull away with apparent discomfort at the physical contact. Maria Henderson cried quietly while Jonathan alternated between staring at his son in disbelief and burying his face in his hands. Their presence, legally required for the questioning of a minor, created a stark visual contrast that was not lost on the detectives. On one side of the table, two adults emotionally devastated by the situation. On the other, a blood-stained 13-year-old discussing his methodical killing of a teammate with the detachment one might use to describe a science project. Near the end of the interview, Detective Bennett directly confronted the central question that had emerged throughout the interrogation. "Eric, do you feel bad about what happened to Jason?" After a brief pause, during which his parents leaned forward in apparent hope of finally seeing some emotional response, Eric replied, "I feel bad that it had to happen, but Jason should have understood his place. If he hadn't scored that goal and taken all the attention, everything would be normal right now, so really, it's kind of his fault too." This response, suggesting both a lack of remorse and a disturbing externalization of responsibility, prompted Maria Henderson to finally break her silence, crying out, "Eric, how can you say that? You killed that boy." Eric turned to his mother with an expression of genuine puzzlement and asked, "But don't you understand? He embarrassed me in front of everyone." Following the formal interrogation, Eric was transferred to the juvenile detention facility to await arraignment, with prosecutors already preparing motions to have him tried as an adult, given the nature of the crime and his responses during questioning. Detective Bennett met briefly with District Attorney Olivia Wilson to share his impressions of the interview, particularly his concerns about Eric's psychological state. "In 20 years of interviewing suspects, I've never seen someone so young demonstrate such a profound disconnect between their actions and normal human emotion," Bennett told Wilson. "It wasn't that he was trying to appear tough or unaffected. He genuinely didn't seem to understand why killing someone over perceived humiliation was disproportionate or wrong." The following day, forensic psychologist Dr. Melissa Chen conducted the first of what would become multiple psychological evaluations of Eric Henderson. Her initial report, later entered into evidence at trial, noted several disturbing observations. Subject displays significant traits associated with callous, unemotional personality, including absence of empathy, failure to recognize the emotional states of others, and an inflated sense of his own importance. Most concerning is his ability to articulate his reasoning for the murder in a way that reflects logical consistency within his own distorted value system, suggesting that this was not an impulsive act, but a calculated response to a perceived status threat. This professional assessment would become a cornerstone of the prosecution's argument that Eric Henderson, despite his chronological age, demonstrated a level of criminal thinking more typical of adult offenders with antisocial personality disorders. In the days following his arrest, Eric's behavior in detention continued to reinforce concerns about his psychological state. Juvenile detention officers noted that while most young offenders struggle with the realities of confinement, particularly those facing serious charges, Eric adapted with unusual ease. He followed rules precisely, interacted politely with staff, and spent most of his time reading or drawing meticulously detailed soccer diagrams. When another detained juvenile made a comment about the murder case after recognizing Eric from news reports, Eric responded not with anger or distress, but with what the supervising officer described as pride, like someone who felt they'd finally been recognized for an achievement. This incident resulted in Eric being moved to a more isolated housing area for his own protection and to prevent him from developing a sense of notoriety or status from his actions. A key breakthrough in understanding Eric's mindset came when investigators, acting on information from Eric's online communications, interviewed several members of his gaming community who had interacted with him regularly in the weeks leading up to the murder. One online friend, A 16-year-old from Oregon, who knew Eric only by his username, provided chat logs in which Eric had discussed his growing resentment of Jason in disturbing detail. "He keeps trying to help me like I'm some charity case," Eric had written 3 weeks before the murder. "Everyone thinks he's so perfect, but they don't see how fake it is. He only helps me to make himself look good." When the online friend had suggested that perhaps Jason was genuinely trying to be supportive, Eric's response had been telling. "Nobody does anything without wanting something in return. He helps me so everyone will think he's such a great teammate, but really he's just building himself up by making me look like I need his help." These online conversations, combined with the journal entries found in Eric's room and his statements during interrogation, painted a picture of a deeply disturbed young man whose worldview had become increasingly distorted by pathological jealousy and status anxiety. The foundational evidence of the security footage, showing the brutal, methodical nature of the attack, could now be contextualized within Eric's psychological framework, where the murder represented not an impulsive act of rage, but the logical conclusion of a process of dehumanizing a teammate who had come to symbolize everything Eric resented about his own perceived failures and inadequacies. As the case moved toward arraignment, with prosecutors seeking to try Eric as an adult on charges of first-degree murder with special circumstances, the interrogation that had begun in that jail interview room continued to reverberate through the criminal justice system. The disturbing insights it had provided into the mind of a 13-year-old killer would form the basis for one of the most controversial trials in California history, a case that would challenge fundamental assumptions about juvenile culpability, force a reckoning with the dark side of youth sports culture, and ultimately lead to an unprecedented sentencing decision that would leave a courtroom in stunned silence and spark a national debate about justice, rehabilitation, and the rare but real phenomenon of children who kill with adult-like calculation and an absence of remorse. The San Diego County Courthouse stood imposingly against the clear blue California sky on the morning of February 7, 2022, as the trial of Eric Henderson officially began. The 5-month delay between arrest and trial had been filled with pre-trial motions, psychological evaluations, and intense legal battles over whether a 13-year-old defendant could or should face adult charges for even the most heinous crimes. Judge Martha Wilkins had ultimately ruled that the case met the exceptional criteria required under California law to try a juvenile as an adult, citing the premeditated nature of the crime, the extreme brutality of the execution, and the defendant's demonstrated lack of remorse or rehabilitation potential. Outside the courthouse, protesters from both sides of the juvenile justice debate had gathered, some holding signs declaring children don't belong in adult courts, while others displayed photos of Jason Colley with the message, "Remember the victim." Inside Courtroom 4C, specially selected for its larger capacity to accommodate the intense media and public interest, the atmosphere was tense as Judge Wilkins entered and called the court to order. "The state of California versus Eric Henderson," the clerk announced, and all eyes turned to the defendant's table where Eric sat between his attorneys, looking remarkably small in his navy blue suit that his parents had purchased for the trial. At just 5 feet tall and barely 100 pounds, Eric's physical appearance emphasized his youth in stark contrast to the adult proceedings around him. Yet observers were struck by his composure. While his parents sat ashen-faced in the front row behind him, Eric himself surveyed the courtroom with what several journalists would later describe as curious detachment, occasionally making notes on a legal pad as if he were observing someone else's trial, rather than facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. District Attorney Olivia Wilson, known for her meticulous preparation and commanding courtroom presence, approached the jury for her opening statement with a large monitor beside her. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom. On September 19, 2021, 14-year-old Jason Colley was brutally murdered at the North County Soccer Complex after helping his team win a championship game. The evidence will show that his killer was his 13-year-old teammate, Eric Henderson, who attacked him with such sustained violence and deliberate cruelty that it defies everything we want to believe about children. Wilson then warned the jury that what they were about to see was disturbing but essential to understanding the case before playing a carefully edited 2-minute segment of the security footage showing the beginning and end of Eric's attack on Jason, as well as the post-mortem carving of his jersey number. The impact of the video on the courtroom was immediate and profound. Several jurors visibly recoiled, with one older woman briefly covering her eyes before forcing herself to watch. In the gallery, Jason's mother, Karen, collapsed against her husband's shoulder, while Mark Colley stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, having insisted on being present for every moment of the trial, despite the pain it would cause. Most telling was the reaction, or lack thereof, from Eric Henderson, who watched the footage of himself killing Jason with the same impassive expression he had maintained since entering the courtroom. This contrast between the emotional response of everyone else in the room and the defendant's apparent detachment did not go unnoticed by the jury, many of whom glanced repeatedly between the violent images on screen and the seemingly unbothered teenager accused of creating them. Wilson continued her opening statement by laying out the prosecution's case with methodical precision. This trial will center around 3 key questions, she told the jury. First, did Eric Henderson kill Jason Colley? The evidence on this point is overwhelming. Multiple eyewitnesses and security footage leave no doubt about who committed this crime. Second, was the killing premeditated? We will present evidence from Eric's own writings and online communications showing that he had been fixating on Jason for weeks, growing increasingly resentful of his teammate's success and the attention he received. Finally, does Eric Henderson, despite his young age, possess the mental capacity to be held accountable as an adult for his actions? On this point, we will present expert testimony from psychologists who have evaluated Eric and found that he demonstrates a level of calculation, planning, and moral reasoning consistent with adult-level culpability, particularly in his clear understanding of the finality of death and his deliberate decision to end Jason's life over a perceived status threat. Defense attorney Richard Martinez, a veteran juvenile defender known for his passionate advocacy against trying children as adults regardless of their alleged crimes, approached the jury with a markedly different tone. What happened to Jason Colley was a tragedy, he acknowledged, his voice solemn. No one, least of all the defense, will attempt to diminish the loss suffered by the Colley family, or suggest that what occurred was anything less than horrific. But justice is not served by ignoring decades of scientific research on adolescent brain development and the fundamental differences between juvenile and adult offenders. Martinez then outlined the defense's central argument, that regardless of the severity of the crime, Eric Henderson was a child whose brain was still developing, particularly in the regions responsible for impulse control, consequence assessment, and emotional regulation. The law recognizes that children are different, Martinez argued, not to excuse their actions but to account for their capacity for rehabilitation and change in ways that adults simply are not capable of. Trying a 13-year-old as an adult ignores this fundamental biological reality. The first witness called by the prosecution was Detective Ryan Bennett, who walked the jury through the investigation from the initial 911 call to the arrest of Eric Henderson at the scene. Bennett's testimony was measured and professional, but his description of finding Eric calmly sitting beside the body, still holding the knife he had used to carve his jersey number into Jason's chest, landed with impact in the silent courtroom. When Wilson asked Bennett about Eric's demeanor during the subsequent interrogation, the detective chose his words carefully. "In my 20 years of law enforcement, I've interviewed hundreds of suspects immediately after violent crimes. Most show some form of emotional distress, anger, fear, remorse, sometimes even relief. Eric displayed none of these typical reactions. He discussed killing Jason and his reasons for doing so with the same effect you or I might use to discuss what we had for breakfast. Factual, straightforward, without apparent emotional connection to the gravity of his actions." The prosecution then called Dr. Alicia Ramirez, the medical examiner who had performed the autopsy on Jason Colley. Using clinical language, but clearly affected by the youth of her subject, Dr. Ramirez detailed the extensive injuries that had caused Jason's death. The victim suffered multiple skull fractures and catastrophic brain trauma consistent with repeated high-force impacts against a hard surface. Based on the injury pattern, approximately 30 distinct impacts occurred, with the first several likely rendering the victim unconscious within 60-90 seconds of the attack beginning. When asked about the carved number on Jason's chest, Dr. Ramirez confirmed that these wounds had been inflicted post-mortem. The cuts were made with precision, showing steady hand control and applied pressure. The lack of vital reaction in the surrounding tissue confirms the victim was already deceased when this mutilation occurred. This testimony supported the prosecution's argument that the attack had continued long past any heat of passion and had concluded with a calculated act of symbolic marking that demonstrated premeditation and unusual psychological detachment. The court then heard from the 6 teammates who had witnessed the attack, each providing hauntingly similar accounts of Eric's sudden violence and their own shocked paralysis as they watched their friend being killed. 15-year-old Michael Chen, the team captain, broke down several times during his testimony, describing how he had tried to approach Eric during the attack only to back away when Eric threatened him. The look in his eyes wasn't like someone who was angry or out of control, Michael testified. It was cold, like he was completely focused on what he was doing, and nothing else mattered. Another teammate, 14-year-old David Rodriguez, described the aftermath. When it was finally over, Eric just stood up and looked down at Jason like he was checking his work. Then he got his knife out and started cutting Jason's jersey off. I kept thinking he would stop and realize what he'd done, but he never did. He looked satisfied. As the first day of testimony concluded, the prosecution had established the basic facts of the case through eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence, and the devastating security footage that left no doubt about what had physically occurred that September evening. Judge Wilkins adjourned until the following morning, instructing the jury to avoid all media coverage of the case, a nearly impossible task given the national attention the trial had attracted. Outside the courthouse, commentators from across the political spectrum debated the merits of trying such a young defendant as an adult, with legal experts weighing in on the precedents being established and the potential long-term implications for juvenile justice. Meanwhile, Eric Henderson was returned to the Juvenile Detention Center where, according to guards who would later be called to testify, he spent the evening reading a soccer strategy book and asking detailed questions about the next day's proceedings with what they described as academic interest rather than personal concern. Day 2 of the trial focused on establishing motive and premeditation through Eric's own words and actions prior to the murder. The prosecution called Eric's English teacher, who testified about a creative writing assignment submitted 3 weeks before the murder, in which Eric had written a story about a jealous teammate who couldn't stand living in someone else's shadow. When asked if this had raised concerns at the time, the teacher acknowledged that while the content was dark, nothing in it explicitly suggested violence, and creative writing is often an outlet for processing difficult emotions. This testimony led into the introduction of Eric's journal entries and online messages, read aloud by Detective Bennett, which showed a progressively darkening obsession with Jason Colley and the perceived injustice of his success. The most damning evidence came from Eric's online gaming friend, testifying remotely from Oregon, who recounted conversations where Eric had explicitly discussed doing something about Jason that would make everyone remember who the real star of the team was. When the defense attempted to characterize these messages as typical teenage hyperbole, the prosecution countered with evidence that Eric had searched online for information about human skull structure and how hard to hit someone to cause unconsciousness in the days leading up to the championship game. This digital trail, meticulously documented by forensic analysts who had examined Eric's devices, painted a picture not of a momentary loss of control, but of a calculated act preceded by research and contemplation. By the third day of the trial, the prosecution shifted focus to the institutional failures that had enabled Eric's behavior to escalate unchecked. Wilson called several school administrators who admitted, under cross-examination, that they had been aware of previous violent incidents involving Eric, but had classified them as behavioral issues rather than potential warning signs of serious psychological disturbance. The athletic director of Wilson Middle School testified that he had intervened to prevent Eric's suspension after he broke another student's arm during a dispute, acknowledging that his decision was influenced by Eric's importance to the soccer program. This testimony visibly affected the jury, many of whom appeared shocked at the systematic way in which adults had prioritized athletic achievement over addressing clearly problematic behavior. The fourth day brought perhaps the most anticipated testimony of the trial, as forensic psychologist Dr. Melissa Chen took the stand to present her evaluation of Eric Henderson. Dr. Chen, a nationally recognized expert in adolescent criminal psychology, had spent over 30 hours evaluating Eric through interviews, standardized assessments, and review of his history. Her conclusion was unequivocal and devastating for the defense. Eric Henderson presents with a significant cluster of traits associated with developing psychopathy, including profound deficits in empathy, callous disregard for others, grandiose sense of self-importance, and the ability to plan and execute harmful actions without emotional interference. When asked whether these traits were simply part of normal adolescent development, Dr. Chen was equally clear. While all teenagers experience emotional volatility and are still developing moral reasoning, Eric's presentation is not within the normal spectrum of adolescent behavior. The calculation evidenced in both the planning and execution of this homicide, combined with his complete lack of emotional response to having taken a life, represents a pattern we see in only the most concerning subset of juvenile offenders, those who demonstrate adult-like criminal thinking despite their chronological age. As the first week of the trial concluded, the courtroom dynamics had settled into a pattern that legal observers found particularly disturbing. While the evidence presented grew increasingly damning, Eric Henderson himself remained a study in detachment, occasionally conferring quietly with his attorneys but showing no discernible emotional response to testimony about his actions or their impact on others. In the gallery, the contrast between the Colley family, visibly devastated anew with each piece of evidence, and the Henderson parents, who appeared increasingly shell-shocked as the trial progressed, created a tableau of suffering that extended far beyond the defendant himself. Judge Wilkins, known for her precise management of complex trials, maintained tight control over the proceedings while allowing sufficient latitude for both prosecution and defense to present their cases fully, aware that the unprecedented nature of the case and the age of the defendant made the trial particularly vulnerable to appellate challenges. The stage was thus set for the most controversial phase of the trial as the defense prepared to present its case centered not on denying Eric's actions, but on challenging his capacity to be held accountable for them as an adult. with the prosecution having established the what of the crime in devastating detail. The trial would now turn to the more complex question of the who, specifically whether Eric Henderson was, despite his youth, fully capable of the type of premeditated malice that defines adult criminal responsibility, or whether his actions, however horrific, must be understood and addressed within the context of an immature brain still years away from full development. This philosophical and legal question, playing out in a courtroom filled with grieving families, attentive jurors, and a seemingly impassive teenage defendant, would ultimately lead to a verdict and sentence that would challenge fundamental assumptions about justice, culpability, and the capacity for evil in the very young. As the trial entered its second week, the courtroom fell silent when Dr. James Patterson, the defense's expert witness and a renowned neuroscientist specializing in adolescent brain development, took the stand. With nearly 30 years of research experience and hundreds of peer-reviewed publications, Dr. Patterson had testified in numerous cases involving juvenile defendants, consistently advocating for developmental considerations in sentencing. His testimony began with a comprehensive overview of adolescent brain development, complete with brain scans and research data projected onto screens visible to the jury. The prefrontal cortex, which controls impulse regulation, consequence assessment, and emotional processing, isn't fully developed until the mid-20s, Dr. Patterson explained, indicating regions on the brain scans. This isn't a matter of opinion or legal philosophy. It's biological fact, supported by decades of consistent research across multiple scientific disciplines. Defense attorney Richard Martinez guided Dr. Patterson through a series of questions designed to establish that, regardless of the severity of Eric's actions, his neurological development was that of a typical 13-year-old. In your expert opinion, Dr. Patterson, is it possible for a 13-year-old to fully comprehend the permanence of death and the full moral implications of taking another human life in the same way an adult can? Martinez asked. Dr. Patterson's response was measured but firm. While adolescents intellectually understand that death is permanent, their emotional and moral processing of that reality is fundamentally different from adults. They lack the neurological structures to fully integrate the abstract concept with the emotional weight it carries. This doesn't mean they can't distinguish right from wrong, but rather that the decision-making process occurs in a brain that prioritizes immediate concerns, like status, perceived threats, or emotional reactions, over long-term consequences in ways that adult brains simply do not. During cross-examination, prosecutor Olivia Wilson focused on exceptions to Dr. Patterson's generalized claims about adolescent development. Doctor, would you agree that there is significant variation in developmental trajectories among adolescents, with some developing mature reasoning earlier than others? She asked. Dr. Patterson acknowledged this point but emphasized that even precocious development would not place a 13-year-old brain on par with an adult's in terms of impulse control and emotional regulation. Wilson then pivoted to the specific evidence in the case. Dr. Patterson, how do you reconcile your general claims about adolescent impulsivity with the evidence we've seen of Eric Henderson researching skull structure, planning this attack, and carrying it out with methodical precision over an 8-minute period, continuing long after his victim was unconscious? The question hung in the air as Dr. Patterson paused, visibly uncomfortable, before responding. While the behavior described is certainly atypical and deeply concerning, it doesn't negate the underlying neurological reality of an immature brain. Even planned violence in adolescence stems from a system that processes information, particularly emotional information, differently than adult brains do. The exchange grew more heated as Wilson pressed further. So, to be clear, Doctor, you're suggesting that carving one's jersey number into the chest of a murder victim after methodically killing them over 8 minutes could still be consistent with normal adolescent brain development? Dr. Patterson's response was careful. I'm suggesting that attributing adult-like culpability to any 13-year-old, regardless of their actions, misunderstands fundamental neurological reality. What Eric Henderson did was horrific and clearly pathological, but treating him as if his brain functions like an adult's is scientifically unsound. This testimony, while technically accurate regarding general adolescent development, appeared to land poorly with several jurors who had been visibly affected by the security footage and eyewitness accounts of Eric's calculated behavior during and after the murder. Following Dr. Patterson's testimony, the defense called child psychiatrist Dr. Elena Suarez, who had evaluated Eric specifically for the trial. Unlike Dr. Patterson, who had spoken about adolescent development in general terms, Dr. Suarez addressed Eric's psychological state directly. Eric presents with a complex clinical picture, she testified. While he demonstrates concerning traits related to empathy deficits and grandiose self-perception, these exist within the context of an immature brain that cannot fully process the emotional and moral dimensions of his actions. When asked directly whether she believed Eric understood the wrongfulness of killing Jason, Dr. Suarez offered a nuanced response. He understands intellectually that killing is against the law and generally considered wrong, but his emotional and moral processing of that understanding is fundamentally distorted by both his developmental stage and what appears to be an emerging personality disorder that would typically not be diagnosable until adulthood. The prosecution's cross-examination of Dr. Suarez was among the most compelling moments of the trial. Wilson approached the witness stand with a transcript of Eric's police interview in hand. "Doctor, you've testified that Eric's understanding of his actions is limited by his developmental stage," she began. "I'd like to read a quote from his interview immediately following the murder. When asked why he continued attacking Jason after he was clearly unconscious, Eric stated, 'I needed to be sure he wouldn't get back up. Each time I thought about stopping, I remembered how everyone cheered for him instead of me, and I kept going. It wasn't about time. It was about finishing what I started.'" Does this statement suggest someone who doesn't understand the permanence of death or the consequences of his actions? Dr. Suarez appeared momentarily flustered before responding that understanding could be intellectual without being emotional, but Wilson continued pressing with additional quotes that demonstrated Eric's calculated reasoning, eventually asking, "Isn't it possible, Doctor, that what we're seeing in Eric Henderson isn't just normal adolescent limitations, but something far more concerning, a young person who fully understood exactly what he was doing but simply didn't care?" The most dramatic testimony came when the prosecution recalled Dr. Melissa Chen in rebuttal to directly address the defense expert's claims. "There is a critical distinction to be made," Dr. Chen explained, "between typical adolescents whose decision-making is impaired by normal developmental limitations and the rare subset of juvenile offenders who demonstrate calculated violence that isn't primarily the result of poor impulse control or peer influence, but rather reflects a fundamental disconnection between understanding and caring about the harm they cause others." Using the security footage as reference, Dr. Chen pointed out specific moments that demonstrated Eric's unusual level of control and deliberation. Notice here, at timestamp 342, how he pauses, looks around to check if anyone is approaching, then resumes the attack with the same methodical force. This isn't the behavior of someone overcome by impulse or emotion. It's someone executing a plan with awareness of their surroundings and potential consequences. The testimony that perhaps most damaged the defense's case came not from expert witnesses, but from Eric's former coach, Mike Donovan, who had worked with both Eric and Jason for the previous year. Visibly uncomfortable on the stand, Donovan recounted an incident from practice 6 weeks before the murder. "We were doing penalty kick drills, and Jason was consistently making his shots while Eric was struggling. After practice, I overheard Eric tell another player, "One day everyone's going to realize which one of us actually matters." At the time, I thought it was just competitive talk, the kind of thing athletes say to motivate themselves. When asked if he had noticed other concerning behaviors from Eric, Donovan hesitated before admitting, "There were times when Eric would stare at Jason during practice with this intensity that felt wrong somehow, and after games where Jason played well, Eric would become completely withdrawn, refusing to participate in team celebrations." This testimony, from someone who had known both boys well, provided a window into the progression of Eric's resentment toward Jason that connected directly to the motive for the murder. Perhaps the most psychologically revealing testimony came from Eric's online gaming friend, 16-year-old Tyler Jenkins, who appeared via video link. Jenkins shared chat. Logs from conversations with Eric in the weeks leading up to the murder, including one exchange 3 days before the championship game. "I told him everyone on the team contributes, not just the goal scorers," Jenkins testified, and Eric wrote back, "You don't get it. People only remember who scores, not who does all the work. If Jason scores in the championship, everyone will think he's the reason we won, not me. I can't let that happen." When Jenkins had asked what Eric meant, the response had been chilling. "I'll make sure people remember the right person." Jenkins testified that he hadn't taken these messages seriously at the time, assuming it was just typical teenage venting, but after learning about the murder, he had immediately contacted police with the chat records, which digital forensics experts subsequently verified as authentic. The most heart-wrenching testimony came from Jason's parents, Mark and Karen Colley, who took the stand to provide victim impact statements midway through the second week of the trial. Karen Colley, composed but with visible grief etching her features, described her son's character and dreams. Jason wanted to become a sports medicine doctor. He spent extra time helping teammates who were struggling, including Eric. The night before the championship, he called Eric to practice visualization techniques for penalty kicks because he knew Eric was nervous about it. Mark Colley's testimony was more raw, his voice breaking repeatedly as he described identifying his son's body at the morgue. "No parent should ever have to see their child like that. The detective warned me it was bad, but nothing prepares you for seeing your 14-year-old son's face beaten beyond recognition with some other kid's jersey number carved into him like he was property." This testimony visibly affected several jurors, with two openly wiping away tears while Eric Henderson continued to stare straight ahead, his expression unchanged. In a surprising development, the defense called Eric's parents, Jonathan and Maria Henderson, to testify about their son's development and character. Both appeared shell-shocked and aging years beyond their actual age, clearly devastated by both their son's actions and the implications about their own parenting. Eric was always intense about his interests, Maria testified, her voice barely audible at times. When he was younger, it was dinosaurs, then space, then soccer. Whatever he focused on, he was all in, almost obsessively so. But we never saw violence, never anything that made us think he could do something like this. When asked directly if they had noticed any animosity between Eric and Jason, Jonathan Henderson shook his head. "Jason came to our house several times to practice with Eric. They seemed to get along fine. Eric would be quieter after Jason left, but we thought he was just tired from practicing." This testimony inadvertently reinforced the prosecution's portrayal of Eric as someone capable of hiding his true feelings and planning methodically rather than acting on uncontrollable impulses. The most shocking moment of the trial came when the defense, in a high-risk strategy, called Eric Henderson himself to testify. At 13, rail-thin in his navy suit with his hair neatly combed, Eric looked every bit the child he chronologically was as he took the stand. His attorney's questions were carefully structured to emphasize his youth and normal interests, school, video games, soccer, before gradually approaching the events of September 19th. When finally asked to explain what happened that day, Eric spoke in a clear, steady voice that belied his age. "I worked really hard all season. I was supposed to be the one who won the championship for us, but I missed the penalty, and then Jason scored, and suddenly he was the hero instead of me." This matter-of-fact explanation, delivered without apparent emotion, sent murmurs through the courtroom that Judge Wilkins quickly silenced with her gavel. During cross-examination, Prosecutor Wilson approached Eric with measured steps, careful to maintain appropriate questioning for a juvenile witness while not shying away from the gravity of his actions. "Eric, do you understand that Jason is never coming back? That his parents will never see him graduate, never see him go to college, never see him get married or have children?" she asked. Eric's response sent chills through the courtroom. "Yes, I understand he's dead. That's what happens when someone dies. They don't come back." When pressed about whether he felt remorse for what he had done, Eric appeared genuinely confused by the question. "I feel bad that it had to happen, but Jason knew how important that game was to me. He should have let me take the winning shot instead of doing it himself." This response, suggesting that the victim shared blame for his own murder, caused Jason's mother to sob audibly in the gallery while several jurors visibly recoiled. Perhaps the most revealing exchange came when Wilson asked Eric directly about the 8-minute duration of the attack. "Why did you continue hitting Jason's head against the concrete long after he stopped moving or responding?" she asked. Eric's response was delivered with the same dispassionate tone he had maintained throughout. "I needed to be sure. When you start something important, you have to finish it properly." When asked about carving his jersey number into Jason's chest, Eric explained as if discussing a logical decision. "I wanted everyone to remember it was my number, my position. Jason was getting credit that should have been mine, so I put my mark on him." This testimony, more than any expert analysis, seemed to crystallize for the jury the disturbing disconnect between Eric's chronological age and his psychological presentation. A young person who understood exactly what he was doing, but placed his own status and recognition above another human life in a way that transcended typical adolescent egocentrism. The final day of testimony brought the school principal and district superintendent to the stand, both compelled to testify about the system's failure to address Eric's previous violent incidents. Internal emails projected on screens throughout the courtroom showed administrators discussing how to handle the Eric Henderson situation discreetly to avoid losing our star player before the tournament season. The superintendent admitted under intense questioning that policies requiring reporting of violent incidents to parents and authorities had been circumvented in Eric's case multiple times, acknowledging that, in retrospect, our focus on athletic achievement created blind spots that may have contributed to this tragedy. This testimony shifted some focus from Eric's individual pathology to the systemic failures that had enabled his behavior to escalate unchecked, raising uncomfortable questions about adult culpability in the tragedy. In their closing arguments, both attorneys delivered powerful summations of their positions. Defense attorney Martinez emphasized the biological reality of adolescent brain development and the legal tradition of treating juvenile offenders differently. No matter how heinous the crime, no matter how disturbing the details, we cannot ignore the fundamental fact that a 13-year-old brain is not an adult brain, he argued. Justice that ignores science is not justice at all, but merely revenge dressed in legal terminology. His closing plea was for Eric to be adjudicated within the juvenile system, where he could receive intensive psychological treatment while being held accountable for his actions in a setting designed for young offenders. Prosecutor Wilson's closing argument acknowledged the complexity of the case while firmly rejecting the notion that Eric's age should be the determining factor in how justice was served. The evidence has shown that Eric Henderson understood exactly what he was doing when he took Jason Colley's life, she told the jury. He planned it, he executed it with methodical precision, he attempted to ensure he wouldn't be stopped, and he completed it with a ritualistic marking of his victim. These are not the actions of someone who couldn't understand the consequences of their choices, but of someone who simply valued their own desires, in this case, recognition and status, above another person's right to live. Wilson concluded by reminding the jury that while science about adolescent development applied to populations, justice must be administered to individuals. Eric Henderson may be chronologically 13, but the evidence has shown a level of calculation, planning, and moral disregard that transcends age. Jason Colley deserves justice that reflects the true nature of the crime committed against him, not justice limited by a birth certificate. As Judge Wilkins delivered her instructions to the jury before deliberations, legal observers noted the exceptional care with which she outlined the complex legal standards for finding a juvenile defendant guilty in adult court. You must consider not only whether the prosecution has proven beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant committed the acts in question, she instructed, but also whether they have proven that at the time of those acts, the defendant possessed sufficient maturity, judgment, and emotional development to be held accountable as an adult under the law. With these words, the case that had captivated the nation and forced a reckoning with the darkest aspects of youth violence was placed in the hands of 12 citizens, tasked with determining not just what Eric Henderson had done, a fact established beyond any reasonable doubt, but who he fundamentally was. A child who had committed an adult crime, or something else entirely. A person who, despite his youth, had demonstrated a capacity for calculated evil that transcended the usual boundaries of age and development. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury in State of California versus Eric Henderson reached their verdict on February 24, 2022. The San Diego County Courthouse had been surrounded by media vans and demonstrators since early morning, with separate groups advocating for juvenile justice reform and for stronger consequences for violent youth offenders engaging in tense but non-violent exchanges. Inside Courtroom 4C, the atmosphere was suffocating with tension as Judge Martha Wilkins took the bench at precisely 2 p.m. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" she asked, her voice cutting through the absolute silence that had fallen over the packed room. The jury foreperson, a retired school teacher in her 60s who had remained stoic throughout the trial, stood and replied, "We have, Your Honor." Eric Henderson, now looking somewhat thinner than at the start of the trial, sat between his attorneys with the same impassive expression he had maintained throughout the proceedings. His parents, Jonathan and Maria Henderson, held hands tightly in the front row behind the defense table, both appearing to have aged years in the months since their son's arrest. Across the aisle, Mark and Karen Colley sat surrounded by extended family, their faces drawn with the permanent etching of grief that had become their constant companion since losing their only child. As the court clerk took the verdict form from the bailiff, Karen Colley closed her eyes briefly, her husband's arm tightening around her shoulders in anticipation of the moment they had waited for since that September evening that had destroyed their world. "We, the jury, in the above-entitled case, find the defendant, Eric Henderson, guilty of murder in the first degree, with the special circumstances of lying in wait and extreme cruelty." The clerk's voice was clear and emotionless as she read the verdict, but its impact rippled visibly through the courtroom. Maria Henderson collapsed against her husband with a strangled sob, while Mark Colley pulled his wife closer as tears streamed down both their faces. In the gallery, Jason's teammates, many of whom had testified during the trial, held on to each other, their young faces reflecting complex emotions, relief, sadness, and the lingering trauma of witnessing their friend's murder. Through it all, Eric Henderson remained the still point in the emotional storm, blinking slowly as the verdict was read, but showing no other visible reaction to the knowledge that he now faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. Judge Wilkins thanked the jury for their service before addressing the matter of sentencing. Given the defendant's age and the gravity of this conviction, I am ordering a comprehensive present-tense investigation and evaluation to be completed before the sentencing hearing, which will be scheduled for March 24, 2022. She then looked directly at Eric for the first time since the verdict was read. "Mr. Henderson, you have been found guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances. Do you understand what that means?" Eric nodded slightly before answering in a clear voice that seemed unnaturally composed for a 13-year-old who had just been convicted of murder. "Yes, Your Honor. It means the jury thinks I killed Jason on purpose." This response, delivered without emotion or apparent comprehension of the gravity of his situation, caused several jurors to exchange glances, seeming to confirm the decision they had reached after days of deliberation. The month between verdict and sentencing saw intense debate throughout the legal community and in the media about appropriate consequences for such a young defendant convicted of such a heinous crime. California law provided several options for juveniles tried and convicted as adults, ranging from placement in the juvenile system until age 25, with subsequent transfer to adult prison, to immediate placement in adult facilities with eligibility for parole after serving a minimum sentence. Legal experts appeared on cable news programs arguing passionately for rehabilitation-focused approaches, citing brain development research and international human rights standards regarding children. Victim advocates and prosecutors countered with arguments about justice for Jason Colley and the unusual nature of the crime, which demonstrated calculation and cruelty rarely seen even in adult offenders. During this period, both families experienced the verdict in profoundly different ways. The Colleys, while expressing relief that Eric had been held accountable, made clear through their attorney that no outcome could bring back their son. Mark and Karen Colley are grateful for the jury's careful consideration of the evidence, their statement read, but they want to emphasize that there are no winners in this situation. Two families have been destroyed, and a young life has been lost forever. The Hendersons, meanwhile, retreated from public view entirely, declining all interview requests and appearing only for required meetings with Eric's defense team and court-appointed psychological evaluators. Sources close to the family reported that they were completely shattered by both their son's actions and the harsh reality of his future. The pre-sentencing evaluation of Eric Henderson, conducted by a team of forensic psychologists and juvenile justice specialists, produced a 78-page report that would heavily influence Judge Wilkins's sentencing decision. The report detailed Eric's psychological profile in clinical terms. Subject demonstrates significant traits associated with callous, unemotional personality, including marked deficits in empathy, grandiose sense of self-importance, and utilitarian view of others as tools for achieving personal goals rather than as full human beings deserving of consideration. Most concerning to the evaluators was Eric's continued inability to demonstrate genuine remorse or emotional recognition of the harm he had caused. When discussing the impact of his actions on the victim's family, subject acknowledges intellectual understanding that they are sad, but shows no emotional resonance with their suffering, and continues to express the belief that the victim bears partial responsibility for taking recognition that the subject felt entitled to. On March 24, 2022, the courthouse was again filled to capacity for the sentencing hearing, with overflow rooms established to accommodate the extraordinary public interest in the case. Security had been significantly increased following threats made against both Eric Henderson and Judge Wilkins, reflecting the intense emotions the case had generated nationwide. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was solemn as victim impact statements began the proceedings. Karen Colley approached the podium first, holding a framed photograph of Jason in his soccer uniform, smiling broadly after a game. "This is who my son was," she began, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Not a body in crime scene photos or a victim in testimony, but a boy with dreams and a kind heart who went out of his way to help others, including the person who took his life." Karen's statement continued for 10 minutes, describing Jason's life, his hopes for the future, and the unimaginable void his death had created. "We have been sentenced to a lifetime of grief, of birthdays and holidays, and graduations that will never happen, of grandchildren we will never meet," she said, looking directly at Eric for the first time during the trial. "I want you to know, Eric, that Jason believed in you. He saw potential in you when others didn't. He spent hours trying to help you improve because that's the kind of person he was, someone who lifted others up instead of tearing them down." As she returned to her seat, the silence in the courtroom was broken only by muffled sobs from various corners of the gallery. Mark Colley's statement was briefer but no less impactful, focusing on the systemic failures that had enabled Eric's behavior to escalate unchecked. "My son is dead because adults who knew better chose trophies over safety," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Every coach, every principal, every parent who saw Eric's violence and looked away shares responsibility for creating the conditions that led to my son's murder." He then addressed Eric directly. "I want to hate you for what you did to Jason, for the brutal way you took him from us. But what I feel most is pity. Pity that you were so broken inside that you could do something so monstrous to someone who only wanted to help you succeed." This statement, delivered with raw honesty rather than the venom many had expected, appeared to affect even the most stoic observers in the courtroom. When given the opportunity to make a statement before sentencing, Eric Henderson rose slowly from his seat, appearing small and young in his Navy suit despite the gravity of his conviction. His statement, which his attorneys had later admitted they advised against but could not prevent him from making, would become perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire case. "I'm sorry that Jason's parents are sad," he began in a flat, measured tone. "But Jason knew how important that championship was to me. He took my moment when he scored after I missed. Everyone was looking at him instead of me, and that wasn't fair. I worked harder than him all season." Eric paused, seeming genuinely confused by the audible gasps his words elicited from the gallery. "I don't understand why everyone is so upset with me, but not with Jason for what he did. I had to fix things so people would remember the right person." This statement, revealing a profound disconnection from normal human empathy and moral reasoning, sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Karen Colley buried her face in her husband's shoulder, while Maria Henderson openly wept, turning away from her son for the first time during the proceedings. Judge Wilkins, known for her stoic demeanor, appeared momentarily stunned before regaining her composure and asking Eric if he had anything else to add. "Just that I think everyone is being unfair," he replied with the same flat affect. "Jason knew what he was doing when he took my glory." With these words, Eric sat down, seemingly oblivious to the horrified reactions his statement had provoked or its implications for the sentence he was about to receive. Following a 20-minute recess, during which Judge Wilkins reviewed the pre-sentencing report one final time, the court reconvened for the sentencing decision. "In my 30 years on the bench," Judge Wilkins began, "I have never encountered a case that has troubled me as deeply as this one. The question before me is not whether Eric Henderson committed a horrible crime. The evidence of that is overwhelming and has been confirmed by the jury's verdict. The question is, what justice looks like when the perpetrator of such a crime is chronologically a child, but has demonstrated thinking patterns and behaviors that transcend typical developmental expectations for his age. She continued by acknowledging the complex scientific evidence regarding adolescent brain development, while also emphasizing that the law required individualized assessment rather than categorical rules based solely on age. The pre-sentencing report, along with the evidence presented at trial and the defendant's own statement today, paints a disturbing picture of a young person with profound deficits in the core human capacity for empathy, combined with an inflated sense of entitlement and a willingness to use extreme violence to address perceived slights to his status, Judge Wilkins stated. Most concerning is the defendant's continued inability, even after months of counseling and evaluation, to demonstrate genuine remorse or recognition of the moral wrongfulness of his actions, beyond the abstract understanding that they violated social norms and laws. She then addressed Eric directly. "Mr. Henderson, your actions took the life of Jason Colley in one of the most brutal ways imaginable, and your statements today confirm what the psychological evaluations have suggested, that you remain a profound danger to society due to your inability to value human life when it conflicts with your desires." The courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Wilkins prepared to announce the sentence. Having considered all factors, including the defendant's age, the nature and circumstances of the crime, the psychological evaluations, and the danger to society, I hereby sentence Eric Henderson to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by stunned silence. This sentence, virtually unheard of for a 13-year-old defendant, reflected the judge's assessment that Eric represented an extraordinary case that the juvenile system was not equipped to address. "I recognize the exceptional nature of this sentence," Judge Wilkins continued, "particularly given the defendant's age. However, the evidence has convinced me that Eric Henderson presents a unique danger due to his combination of violent capacity and profound empathy deficits that standard rehabilitation programs are unlikely to address successfully." The reaction to the sentence was immediate and dramatic. Maria Henderson collapsed in her seat, requiring medical attention from court personnel, while Jonathan Henderson stood frozen, staring at the judge in apparent disbelief. Mark and Karen Colley held each other, their expressions reflecting not triumph, but the hollow acknowledgement that no punishment could restore what they had lost. Throughout the gallery, stunned silence gave way to muffled conversations, as the unprecedented nature of the sentence registered with observers. Legal analysts present immediately began discussing the likelihood of appeals, with many predicting that the case would eventually reach the California Supreme Court, or even the U.S. Supreme Court, given the constitutional questions it raised about juvenile sentencing. Most striking was Eric Henderson's own reaction, or lack thereof. As the sentence was pronounced, he displayed the same absence of emotional response that had characterized his demeanor throughout the trial, appearing more curious than distressed as the bailiffs approached to take him into custody. His final words in the courtroom, spoken to his attorney but overheard by several nearby observers, seemed to confirm the psychological assessment that had led to his extraordinary sentence. "How long do I have to be there? I still don't think this is fair." This apparent inability to grasp the gravity of his situation or the finality of his sentence reinforced for many the disturbing disconnect between Eric's chronological age and his psychological reality, a 13-year-old body housing something that even experienced mental health professionals struggled to fully categorize or explain. As Eric Henderson was led from the courtroom to begin serving a sentence that would, barring successful appeals, keep him imprisoned for the rest of his life, the courtroom remained in a state of stunned silence. Judge Wilkins's decision had transcended typical legal boundaries, reflecting a judgment that in rare and extreme cases, chronological age alone could not determine appropriate consequences when the nature of the crime and the psychological profile of the perpetrator demonstrated such profound aberration from normal developmental patterns. The sentence would spark intense debate throughout the legal system and society at large about justice, rehabilitation, and the rare but real phenomenon of children who kill with adult-like calculation and an absence of remorse. As one legal observer would later write, the silence that fell over that courtroom wasn't just shock at the severity of the sentence. It was the collective recognition that we had encountered something our legal system, our psychological frameworks, and our social understanding of childhood were not fully equipped to address. The sentencing of 13-year-old Eric Henderson to life without parole for the murder of Jason Colley sent shockwaves through the American legal system and sparked a national debate about juvenile justice that continued long after the courthouse doors closed on that March afternoon in 2022. Within hours of Judge Wilkins's decision, legal experts from across the political spectrum appeared on news programs to debate the constitutionality and moral implications of imposing such a severe sentence on someone so young. Conservative commentators pointed to the calculated nature of the crime and Eric's continued lack of remorse as justification for treating him as an adult, while progressive voices argued that no matter how heinous the crime, a 13-year-old's brain was biologically incapable of the same level of culpability as an adult's. The case quickly became a flashpoint in broader discussions about criminal justice reform, with both sides using it to illustrate their positions on how society should balance punishment, protection, and rehabilitation. The Henderson family, devastated by both their son's actions and his unprecedented sentence, withdrew completely from public view following the trial. Sources close to the family reported that Jonathan and Maria Henderson sold their San Diego home within months of the sentencing and relocated to another state, seeking anonymity and a chance to rebuild some semblance of life away from the notoriety the case had brought them. Their last public statement, released through their attorney, expressed profound sorrow for the Colley family's loss, while also indicating their intent to appeal the sentence. While we cannot begin to comprehend the pain that Jason's family has endured, we believe the sentence imposed on our 13-year-old son violates constitutional principles regarding juvenile justice. We will continue to fight for a sentence that acknowledges both the severity of Eric's actions and his status as a child whose brain is still developing. This appeal, filed in April 2022, would begin a legal process expected to take years as it moved through the appellate courts. The Colley family approached the aftermath of the trial with a different focus, channeling their grief into advocacy work aimed at preventing similar tragedies. Karen Colley established the Jason Colley Foundation, dedicated to promoting mental health awareness in youth sports and training coaches to recognize warning signs of potentially violent behavior in young athletes. "Nothing will bring Jason back to us," she said during the foundation's launch event in June 2022, her voice steady despite the visible grief still etched in her features. But perhaps we can save another family from experiencing this nightmare by ensuring that the warning signs we now know were present in Eric Henderson aren't ignored in other children. The foundation quickly gained national attention, partnering with major sports organizations to develop protocols for identifying and addressing concerning behaviors before they escalated to violence. Mark Colley focused his advocacy efforts on holding accountable the institutions that had failed to address Eric's previous violent incidents. In October 2022, the Colleys filed a civil lawsuit against the San Diego Unified School District, several school administrators, and the youth soccer organization, alleging negligence and deliberate concealment of known risks. "My son died because adults who knew better chose trophies and tournament wins over student safety," Mark stated at a press conference announcing the lawsuit. This legal action isn't primarily about money. It's about forcing institutional change and ensuring that no school or sports program ever again prioritizes athletic. achievement over violent warning signs. The lawsuit would eventually result in a $4.8 million settlement and, more significantly, mandated reforms in how schools document and respond to violent incidents among student athletes. The most unexpected development in the aftermath of the trial came from Eric Henderson himself. Transferred to a specialized unit for juvenile offenders within the adult prison system, Eric became the subject of intense interest from psychologists and neuroscientists seeking to understand the rare phenomenon of children who commit calculated homicide without apparent emotional connection to their actions. Dr. Melissa Chen, who had testified at Eric's trial, received permission to conduct a longitudinal study of his psychological development, publishing her initial findings in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in late 2023. Subject EH presents a unique opportunity to track the developmental trajectory of callous, unemotional traits from early adolescence into adulthood, she wrote. Preliminary observations suggest that these traits are becoming more entrenched rather than moderated with age and intervention, raising profound questions about the immutability of certain psychological profiles and the effectiveness of current rehabilitation approaches for this specific subset of juvenile offenders. Perhaps most disturbing were reports from prison staff about Eric's adjustment to incarceration. Unlike most juvenile offenders who typically struggle with the realities of imprisonment, Eric adapted with remarkable ease to institutional life. He follows rules precisely, interacts politely with staff, and has experienced none of the emotional crises we typically see in young inmates, noted one report from his first year in confinement. However, this apparent compliance appears to be instrumental rather than reflective of emotional growth or moral development. When discussed in therapy sessions, Henderson continues to express the belief that his actions were justified by his perception that the victim had stolen recognition that rightfully belonged to him. This combination of superficial adaptation and underlying lack of moral development reinforced for many the exceptional nature of the case and the challenges it posed to conventional understanding of juvenile rehabilitation. In February 2024, the California Court of Appeal heard arguments in Henderson v. State of California, the case challenging Eric's sentence as cruel and unusual punishment given his age at the time of the offense. The hearing drew national attention, with amicus briefs filed by organizations ranging from the American Psychological Association to victims' rights groups. Eric's attorneys argued that recent Supreme Court precedents limiting juvenile life sentences reflected evolving standards of decency and recognition of neurological differences between adolescent and adult brains. State prosecutors countered that these precedents allowed exceptions for the rarest and most disturbing cases, arguing that Eric Henderson represented precisely such an exception, given the calculated nature of his crime and his continued lack of rehabilitation potential as documented by prison psychologists. In a 2-1 decision issued in July 2024, the Court of Appeal upheld Eric's conviction but modified his sentence to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, with the majority opinion stating that, while the heinous nature of the crime and the defendant's psychological profile justify significant punishment, categorical prohibition of potential future rehabilitation violates constitutional principles regarding juvenile sentencing. This modified sentence meant that Eric Henderson would be eligible for parole consideration at age 38, though the decision emphasized that parole would only be granted if he demonstrated significant rehabilitation and reduced risk to society, a standard that his ongoing psychological evaluations suggested would be difficult for him to meet. Both sides indicated their intent to appeal the decision to the California Supreme Court, ensuring that the legal battle over Eric's sentence would continue for years to come. The case's impact extended far beyond the legal system, prompting significant reforms in youth sports culture and school safety protocols. In response to the revelations about how Eric's previous violent incidents had been concealed to protect his athletic contributions, California passed the Jason Colley Student Safety Act in November 2023, requiring schools and youth sports organizations to maintain comprehensive records of all violent incidents, regardless of athletic status, and establishing clear reporting requirements to parents, law enforcement, and mental health professionals. Similar legislation was introduced in 17 other states, with advocates citing the Colley case as evidence of the potentially deadly consequences of prioritizing athletic achievement over addressing concerning behavior. The North County Soccer Complex, site of Jason Colley's murder, underwent significant changes in the aftermath of the tragedy. The bleachers where the attack occurred were removed entirely and replaced with a memorial garden featuring a bronze statue of a young soccer player with Jason's jersey number and the inscription, "In memory of Jason Colley and all young athletes who play with heart, kindness, and true team spirit." The complex also instituted comprehensive security measures, including additional cameras and regular security patrols, reflecting the community's ongoing trauma and determination to prevent future violence. The Oceanside Sharks, the team both boys had played for, permanently retired both Jason's and Eric's jersey numbers and established an annual sportsmanship award in Jason's name, given to the player who best exemplified the qualities of teamwork, mentorship, and character, both on and off the field. The media coverage of the case evolved over time, from sensationalized headlines about a child killer to more nuanced explorations of the complex factors that had contributed to the tragedy. In September 2023, the documentary The Winning Goal, directed by acclaimed filmmaker Rebecca Martinez, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival, examining not just the crime itself but the broader cultural context of youth sports, the pressure placed on young athletes, and the warning signs that had been missed or deliberately ignored. The film featured interviews with Jason's teammates, coaches, and parents, as well as experts in adolescent psychology and juvenile justice, though notably absent were the Henderson family, who declined to participate. The documentary won several awards and was credited with shifting public discourse about the case from simple horror at the crime to more complex considerations of institutional responsibility and prevention. Perhaps the most profound and lasting legacy of the case emerged in the field of adolescent psychology, where researchers increasingly recognized what came to be known as the Henderson paradox, the rare but real phenomenon of chronologically juvenile offenders who demonstrate cognitive patterns and emotional processing more consistent with adult psychopathy than typical adolescent development. Dr. James Patterson, who had testified for the defense about adolescent brain development, published an influential paper in 2024 acknowledging the limitations of age-based generalizations. While the overwhelming majority of juvenile offenders demonstrate the impulsivity, peer influence, and rehabilitation potential we associate with developing brains. The Henderson case forces us to recognize that rare exceptions exist. Young people whose psychological profiles present unique challenges to both our legal frameworks and our rehabilitation models. This nuanced perspective helped bridge the previously polarized debate about juvenile justice, acknowledging both the general validity of developmental considerations while recognizing the need for individualized assessment in exceptional cases. 5 years after the murder, San Diego remained marked by the tragedy in visible and invisible ways. The soccer community had implemented extensive reforms with mandatory mental health education for coaches and regular psychological assessments for players showing signs of concerning behavior. Schools throughout the district operated under new safety protocols specifically designed to identify and address patterns of escalating aggression rather than treating violent incidents as isolated events. The Colley Foundation had expanded nationally, working with schools and sports programs across the country to prevent similar tragedies through early intervention and support. And twice each year, on Jason's birthday and on the anniversary of his death, residents placed soccer scarves, flowers, and notes at the memorial garden that had replaced the bleachers where his life had ended so violently. For the families most directly affected, the aftermath brought vastly different realities. The Hendersons, having relocated and changed their names, struggled to rebuild some semblance of life under the weight of what their son had done, their marriage eventually dissolving under the strain. They maintained minimal contact with Eric through letters and occasional visits, a relationship complicated by his continued inability to demonstrate the emotional growth they desperately hoped to see. The Colleys, while forever changed by their loss, found purpose in their advocacy work and support from a community that had rallied around them. "We live in the after," Karen Colley said during a rare interview on the 5th anniversary of Jason's death. "There's no moving on or getting over it, just learning to carry the grief while trying to create meaning from something so senseless." As for Eric Henderson himself, now 18 years old and 5 years into his sentence, prison records indicated both concerning and contradictory patterns. His academic progress was exceptional, having completed high school equivalency and begun college courses with particular aptitude for mathematics and computer science. His behavior remained impeccable by institutional standards, with no disciplinary incidents and positive reports from staff about his politeness and compliance. Yet psychological evaluations continued to note his profound empathy deficits and his unchanged perspective on his crime, still believing that Jason had provoked the murder by taking recognition Eric felt entitled to. This combination of intellectual advancement and emotional stagnation presented a troubling paradox for those tasked with his eventual parole evaluation, raising the question of whether someone could be simultaneously rehabilitated in terms of functional capability while remaining fundamentally dangerous due to core psychological traits resistant to change. The case of California versus Henderson ultimately forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about justice, development, and the limits of our understanding of the adolescent mind. It challenged simplistic narratives about juvenile offenders, highlighting the exceptional complexity of cases where chronological age conflicts with psychological presentation in ways that strain both legal frameworks and rehabilitation models. It exposed systemic failures across multiple institutions while catalyzing reforms designed to prevent future tragedies. And perhaps most significantly, it demonstrated the profound ripple effects of a single act of violence, how one moment of calculated cruelty on a soccer field could transform countless lives, reshape institutions, and force an entire society to confront questions about justice and accountability for which there are no simple answers. As Judge Wilkins had noted in her sentencing statement, some cases defy our existing categories and force us to reconsider our most fundamental assumptions about childhood, culpability, and the capacity for change. This is one such case, and its implications will likely be felt in our legal system long after everyone in this courtroom has departed.